In today's video, we're going to take a more detailed review of some of the props that you can use for a restorative yoga practice. We're going to try to pick up on a few points which are often missed, but I feel can add real value to your practice. Let's start with two unsung heroes. First of all, a good old pair of socks. Now, socks can be used throughout the class. They quite simply add more warmth and more comfort to the feet. But they are particularly good drawing towards the end of a class. If you think about it, in a restorative yoga class, you are hardly moving. And as your body becomes calmer, it also becomes cooler. And that often impacts the periphery of the body the most. Top of head, feet and hands. So simply bringing a pair of socks to your practice is a great little tool, or if you're teaching, ask your students to bring a pair along. Secondly, something that is often or very rarely used and often missed off, a hoodie. Hoodies are a great bit of kit, you know. Firstly, most of us have a hoodie somewhere at home. We can use it as a substitute for blankets, so we don't need to make that extra investment into different types of blanket, but also we can use it to add more warmth and as a replacement for an eye pillow or an eye mask. Simply cuddling up into the hoodie and then drawing the hood over your eyes creates a bit of a darker shadow, and that encourages yourself or your students to turn inward, to maybe focus on that inner experience rather than the external world, and then it helps them drop into that more restorative state that we're looking to create. Next, while we're talking about eye masks, let's touch on those. Eye pillows and eye masks. So there are probably two categories here that we can look at. This is an eye pillow. It's a weighted and scented eye pillow. The advantages of that are: one, the weighted eye pillow can act similar to weighted blankets. Now, weighted blankets you can use in a restorative practice, but they're primarily used to help people with sleep disorder. If you struggle with sleep, getting a really heavy weighted blanket allows you to feel more cuddled in, more cradled in and safer. And studies have shown that it helps you stay in the cycles of sleep much better for much more longer, it helps you stay in the cycles of sleep much better. So the eye pillows can do the same. Also, scented eye pillows can add that extra element to the practice of aromatherapy, and particularly if they're lavender. Lavender is associated with calming the mind down. Now, as a touch on both of those advantages, they can also be to the detriment of the practice. Aromas in particular, while using oils in your practice can be an invaluable tool at times, for some students they can be quite triggering and quite stimulating. So just be aware of their extra impact onto your session. The other variation is an eye mask, so a sleeper's eye mask. An eye mask isn't weighted, it's often not scented, and it has an elasticated band around the back to keep it onto the face. Now, the advantage here is that you can use an elasticated eye mask in more postures. The weighted eye mask is really only of use if you're lay on your back in a reclining pose. As soon as you lie forwards, obviously it's going to fall off. The elasticated eye masks can quite simply stay on your face for a longer period of time. Let's move on to bolsters. Now, bolsters come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This is probably the most common one that you will find, whether you are practicing in a studio or teaching yourself. Two main considerations here. If the bolster has given it, if there's space in the material and you can maneuver the beans about, it's really important to give that extra bit of instruction and guidance to yourself or your students to make sure that if we need the bolster to be even, that they spend a bit of time puffing up to make it even. Imagine if you're in a reclining pose here. Let's see if we can pick this up on camera. And we've been throwing it all over the place for previous postures. And then look, hopefully you can see that. Can you see how it's very uneven? That's going to really be held in the mind, and it can be quite uncomfortable and quite distracting. So if we need it to be even, make sure that it's even. The other great thing that we can do if you're in reclining poses, that if you bring all the beans towards the middle, that's going to create more lift and potentially more curvature, more stretch, more sensation. If you want less, you can pad things out and make it a little less, so it's a little more supportive. The second consideration, and probably the more important one, is the zip and the seam. So ensuring that where the zip and seam is placed is away from the body. So when the body's resting on it, it's resting away from there. Same too if it has a handle. Just ensuring that if we are reclining against the bolster, we either lay a blanket over it or we simply manoeuvre it in such a way we're not resting against the seam. Let's come to straps. So straps, first of all, again, they can come in lots of shapes and sizes. Generally, we kind of have large straps and extra large straps. I would say if you've got a choice of going for either or, go for the longer ones because it just gives you more options to modify the practice. Two things to consider here. First of all, that when we're looping it, we don't just grab it and it's all mangled and twisted and we start looping it, because that twist, similar to the zip of the bolster, is going to be very distracting to the mind. So we want to be really particular with it, really precise, so that the fold of the strap feels more comforting. Second thing is that once we loop up, where the buckle goes is going to be really important. Again, for some you might feel that that's so subtle it's not going to bother me. I don't mind where the buckle goes. In a restorative practice, when you're there for 3, 4, 5, up to 20 minutes, again, the buckle resting either against the thighs or the back, it's going to be really distracting. So when we're buckling ourselves in, we just make sure that we slide it so that the buckle is away from the flesh, away from distraction. Final thing I should pick up on, don't take it for granted that your students know how to use these. It is fairly simple once you know, like most things in life, but you've got to be taught first. So we bring them both together, we loop it through, we separate them, and we hook it over one and under the other, like so. And that means it's adjustable for us, so we can adjust it to the size and length that we need. And again, just ensuring that there's no twists in the belt. Next, we will come to bricks. Again, there's lots of different variations of bricks. These are my favourite. These are a set of one of the first set of bricks that we bought for a studio nearly 10 years ago, and some of them have survived to this day. How good is that? Like a decade-old brick, amazing. They're softer, that's why I like them, so they're particularly soft. Now, if you're using the harder bricks, and they're the ones that we more commonly see in studios, the hardened cork bricks or even the hardened foam bricks, it might be a consideration to combine the brick with a blanket or a hoodie so there's a greater degree of softness in them. Again, they come in lots of different shapes and sizes, but there is one in particular which has become more common recently, and that's the cheese wedge. So the cheese wedge can be used in different ways. It's particularly good for seated postures and forward folds. So the cheese wedge enables you, if you sit up onto it, to tilt your pelvis into a more what we call anterior tilt, meaning the pubic bone tilts down, the tailbone lifts, and hopefully you can see my lower spine returns to its normal lumbar arch. The reason why I would say that is because at the start of practice and even closing practice, particularly if we're doing some movement and mobilization seated, or we're visually welcoming our students, or you're in practice yourself, often we will come and do our best impression of a yogi, because that's what we like doing when we come to yoga. And everyone thinks they've got to sit cross-heeled and do this kind of thing, which is absolutely fine, and it's great to do. But first of all, remember, we don't need to sit in uncomfortable positions. We can change the position. Secondly, if the knees are riding high like this, it's likely that you're really strong of the inner thighs. You've got a lot of strength there. And then added to that, probably really strong in the back of the legs. So watch what happens when we sit like this. See how that lower lumbar spine now curves in the opposite way. So it begins to round. And when it rounds, it actually means we're taking the spine into a stretch, which if we're sat up, we're actually coming out of our better version of our posture. So we can do two things. We can sit up onto props, or if you have the investment to come into a cheese wedge, then whoosh, cheese wedge, drop it forwards. I really like cheese wedges, really good to use. Finally, we come to what I believe to be the centre point, the centrepiece of restorative practice, and that's a blanket or blankets. So one of my wonderful friends purchased these for me. I believe they were from a very famous Swedish furniture shop. They're quite inexpensive. They're really good for a couple of reasons. One, inexpensive, but also they're really easy to move around. So if you are going to a yoga studio to practice and the studio hasn't got much equipment, you don't want to take everything. In a couple of studios that I teach in, and I teach restorative practice there, or we try to make an attempt of it, we don't have any bolsters, we have bricks, we don't have wedges, we don't have blankets, we don't have eye pillows, we don't have many straps. So one of the things that I bring along for students are blankets, or I ask students to bring hoodies and blankets. They're just really great ways and tools that we can mould into different shapes. We can roll them up to act a little bit like a bolster. We can combine them with bricks to act a little more like a bolster, so they can add some real depth into your practice because they add more support. We can also use them in the way, funnily enough, as they were probably originally designed to be used, as a blanket. So blankets at the end of the practice to keep us nice and warm and that feeling of being cradled in. Or in our forward folding postures, and you'll see this in several videos in this course, to wrap them over the top so we feel that sensation of being bedded in and cradled in, can feel really comforting and very supportive. So blankets, I would say, are one of the few things that it's maybe not one of the few things, but blankets, I would say, are definitely worth the investment. So the final thing I'd like to say, and I'm going to say this without getting on my moral high horse, because those who know me know that is not my vibe whatsoever. But I would like to touch on how it's very easy for us to be drawn into the consumerism that is now almost synonymous with the yoga practice. What I would guide you to do is, first of all, buy the things that you know you're going to get use out of. It's such a crying shame that when you go to the tip and the skip and you look around and there's loads of fitness equipment there and loads of yoga equipment there, and you know right at that point there is someone online looking up to try to buy that thing that is in now the scrap heap. So my advice would be to reach out to your local studio. If you're on social media, get on social media and put out there that you're looking for some props, and you will probably find that there are loads of teachers out there who are willing to sell them used for a reduced rate, or some might even just want the space at home and might gift you them for free. But reach out, particularly with things, you know, blankets can be washed, bolsters can be recovered. You know, bolsters, this is just a bolster covering in here, it's buckwheat. So a second-hand bolster, a used bolster, fantastic, buy that, recover it. So again, without getting on my moral high horse, just remember that the things that we buy and consume and then end up on a scrap heap end up destroying some other being's habitat somewhere else in the world. And we want to try to reduce our impact on the suffering of the world as much as we possibly can.